Okay, continuing on with Chapter 4, this is screencast number 2, and we're continuing on with the same slide, so let's just do a little recap. You have cells. You can have an individual, an organism with a single cell, 1,000 cells, or billions of cells. No matter what size, each cell contains chromosomes, and on those chromosomes are specific locations which are known as genes. So it's basically a chemical sequence on a chromosome. And these genes essentially code for traits which may be expressed traits or not expressed traits. So the term for traits that are expressed is phenotype. So a phenotype might determine things like eye color, the number of arms or legs something possesses, the thickness of its fur, those types of things. But beyond the phenotype, the expressed traits, there's an entire set of chromosomes, which includes of genes, which includes things that are not expressed, and that's known as the genotype. And when you put the entire set together, that's known as a genome. Okay, again, a mutation is a random change in the genetic code, and it can be advantageous or disadvantageous for the organism, but typically it's disadvantageous. Let's look at an example. The one that your textbook uses is a bird that is green in color normally. Sometimes it has a mutation, a recombination, or a change in its DNA and its genes, and that results in the bird having blue feathers instead. And of course the green feather is much better camouflage for the bird than blue feathers. So the bird with the blue feathers is more likely to be spotted by a predator and less likely to live long enough to pass that trait on to its offspring. Okay, so mutations can be disadvantageous or advantageous, but typically they are disadvantageous. Only mutations in reproductive cells are passed on. So again, if you have a mutation in the cell of your big toe, that might be a problem for your big toe, but it's not going to be passed along to your offspring. Only mutations that occur in reproductive cells, such as sperm or eggs, are passed on. Okay, so now we're going to look at two processes of evolution. The first one here is evolution by artificial selection. The other one is called evolution by natural selection. So artificial means when humans determine which individuals breed. And they determine that based on characteristics they might want to see. So the example here is of dogs, okay? And some dogs may be bred for their hunting abilities. Some might be bred to be warm, to keep the human warm. Some might be bred for their ability to defend a person, for example. And so you end up with a whole bunch of different types of different looking dogs, but they are all still dogs. They may have different characteristics, but they are all, in fact, dogs. Now, your textbook uses the example of the wolf, and it's rather hard to tell from the diagram here, but they're saying it's the ancestor of various breeds of dog. And that's true, but it's also now been found that wolves and dogs can both still, in the wild, mate and produce fertile offspring. It's very rare, but it can happen. So technically, the wolf and the dog are the same species. They're now at different levels, such as subspecies, where the wolf has certain chemical characteristics and behavioral characteristics that are not found in dogs, but technically they can mate in the wild and produce fertile offspring, which makes them subspecies instead of different species. Okay, this is the only type of, let me rephrase that. Artificial selection is only when humans intended, on purpose, breed individuals for a particular trait. Another common example is with crops, for example. So years ago, centuries ago, corn was actually very small, and humans chose to take corn that had larger kernels and larger ears and breed those together, and so eventually you get larger corn after successive generations. So that's on purpose. If humans do something, for example, cause air pollution and cause a loss of sunlight due to that, and that changes the species composition in an area, then that's not artificial selection. Artificial selection is when we specifically try to create or to propagate certain characteristics. Okay, enough with artificial selection. Now let's look at evolution by natural selection. And I take this diagram from another textbook from Miller, and I like it because I think it really explains on a shorter time scale something that's been demonstrated to happen. So we have an early fox population here. And within that early fox population, there were individuals who have genes that code for gray or brown fur. And you also had individuals in that early population that had genes that coded for white fur. Likewise, some members of that population had thicker genes for thicker fur, shorter ears, shorter legs, shorter nose, and other foxes in that early population had lighter weight fur, longer ears, legs, nose, etc. And those genes already existed within that early fox population. Over time, some of the foxes moved northward and some moved southward in search most likely of food and habitat, food and mates and so forth. And when they did, those members of the early fox population who had genes that coded for the thick white fur and short ears that didn't give off too much heat, they tended to survive because of camouflage, because of their ability to survive that temperature. There were foxes in that early population that coded for these other traits like here, but they would most likely have been preyed upon by predators or unlikely to survive because they would lose too much heat to the environment. And therefore, they would be less likely to live long enough to pass their genetics, their genes, to an offspring, whereas the Arctic, the white one here, is more likely to survive and therefore pass these traits down to its offspring. And likewise, those that moved southward, where it was warmer and where darker colors would provide a better camouflage, then those are the foxes that were able to survive and reproduce and therefore pass down those traits. And eventually, after many generations, we ended up with two types of foxes, the Arctic fox and the gray fox, which are in fact two distinct species at this point in time. And so to recap what happened here and the definition of evolution by natural selection, you have a population. A population evolves when genes mutate and give some individuals genetic traits that enhance their ability to survive and produce offspring with these traits. Okay, so we want to look at the causes of what causes this population change to happen. So think about those fox populations. Populations evolve by becoming genetically different over time. For most animals that we think of with low reproductive capacity, big animals, for example, that's going to have to require great periods of time to reproduce. But in other organisms that reproduce rapidly, such as bacteria, mutations can occur much more quickly because the amount of generations are also created quickly. So genetic variability is a result of mutations or recombinations, and these are random changes in DNA molecules in genes, and it can occur and typically occurs spontaneously. There are some agents which cause mutations, and for example, radiation is one that causes a mutation. For example, the energy of the sun causing a mutation in your skin, which results in a cancer, for example. But the most important line here is the last one here. It can create a heritable trait only if the mutation occurs in a reproductive cell. So if you had a bird, and let's take that green bird, and it has a genetic mutation of its actual feather to blue, that would not be passed on to its offspring, only if the trait which mutates or the mutation occurs in a reproductive cell. There are limits to adaptation through natural selection. So the desired trait must already be in the gene pool. Remember that group of foxes that I talked about? Some already had that genetic mutation and others had a different one, and therefore that led them to survive. And only organisms which have a high reproductive capacity, so it has offspring rapidly, so these traits can spread rapidly. That's where you're going to be able to physically observe that change. Okay, so here's a summary slide, which actually I'm going to start this one on the next screencast. So I'm going to end it here.